This is Sasha, and we're doing another episode of Building the Open Web. And today we have Yaniv from Graph Protocol.
Hey, Sasha, great to be with you.
Nice to see you. We know each other for a while. I wanted to dive deeper into your background overall, kind of like understand growing up in Silicon Valley. How was it for you? Did you what was it like then?
Yeah, my family moved to Cupertino when I was six, about 1994, and it was pretty wild. Both my parents were engineers. Kind of lived through the .com boom. They were building a lot of infrastructure. My mom worked at a startup that was building cable modems. We're just down the street from Apple. And yeah, remember those early years of tech and startups growing really fast. It seemed like all my friends' parents were working at these startups that were just growing super fast. The internet really started coming online and growing really fast. I was early on like eBay, and a bunch of these different sites started selling things online, and just kind of like figuring out the crazy internet thing.
And did it in any way get you interested in entrepreneurship, or was it not at that point that you were thinking about it?
Yeah, I guess growing up in that environment did, I guess give me the idea that it was possible, right? Because I saw it and I saw these stories. And so I guess I had that awareness from an early age that, a small group of people can actually build something that grows quickly and grows, worldwide.
And how did you get into entrepreneurship for the very first time?
I tried to start a few things while I was in college, but I think my attention was spread pretty thin during that time. I really started my first startup after a stint at HP. So I studied electrical engineering, physics, and math at USC. Then I did 2 years of firmware engineering on laserjet printers at HP. And I was living in Boise, and I think I was getting pretty bored of my environment. And so, I was like reading TechCrunch every day, and, just, watching videos, learning about, startups. And this is like 2011, 2012. And I remember Google announced, what's now Android Pay, and using NFC payments. And I remember thinking, oh, mobile payments is going to change the world. And so I kind of went down that rabbit hole and started my first startup then.
And also, how was your experience after this working at MuleSoft at like larger company, kind of about to go public when we met?
Yeah, MuleSoft was a really interesting, kind of work environment. So I had done, the really big company thing. I had done the small startup thing, and MuleSoft was interesting for me because it was a rapidly growing and scaling enterprise SaaS company focused on building API developer tools. I think it was really instructive for me to see a startup go through this growth phase, and also, seeing what it's like doing enterprise. They had a lot of the Fortune 500 as customers, and so you were working at the sales organization, and I think we both kind of bonded because we're both entrepreneurial. So I was like on the engineering side of the house, you're on the sales side of the house, and I think we are both trying to like learn as much as possible about like these organizations. So that's how we met and started talking. And it was interesting to kind of see what kind of problems large companies have and how they solve those problems. So that was a lot of learning during that time.
And then you jump into entrepreneurship. What gets you into the decentralized world?
So I started thinking about some of these ideas for crypto back in 2011. It was during kind of the Occupy Wall Street time, and we're in the midst of the Great Recession. And I remember just kind of thinking to myself, it's pretty crazy that the internet, really should have changed everything about how humans cooperate, and yet we have all of these like centralized institutions that just felt very kind of like old world, whether it's banks or just how like the laws were being passed, and large corporations. And something about that to me even at the time just felt like the internet should really fundamentally change how people cooperate and organize, and it hasn't yet. So I spent some time thinking about that back then, but then I was working on more practical things, And so whether it was my time at HP or then, doing my startups, all of those thoughts were put on the shelf. And it wasn't until 2017 when Ethereum really started taking off. You could argue that it started before then, that I realized that, this kind of movement was getting started, that, there were enough people now working on this, decentralization vision, that now was the time. And so that's when we kind of, jumped into it.
And how did you set on graph as an idea?
So being at MuleSoft and, actually the startup that we did after that was building React developer tools. I've spent a lot of time focused on developer tools and thinking about how to make application development as easy as possible. So I got really into GraphQL, back when it was first announced. And we started building on Ethereum, in that 2017 timeframe. And it was quickly, obvious that the infrastructure was really early. And, there was this kind of this idea of these serverless apps that you could build and deploy to this, public infrastructure, that would run forever. And the reality wasn't really there yet. You couldn't actually do that. And as soon as you tried to build any kind of real usable application, you'd realize that you couldn't build it directly on top of Ethereum, and you actually needed to write a bunch of like custom code to sync the data and index it and serve it to the client so that your UI could load quickly. And so it's through that experience of like building dApps that we realized that there's this indexing layer that was missing from the stack. So that's how we started building the graph.
And how did you approach adoption and kind of getting to initial customers?
Yeah, I think that's something that we took from the traditional startup world, which is that you want to launch early and iterate with users. So that's what we did. We started talking to projects that were building in the space right away and kind of validating with them, hey, do you have this problem? And we kept getting like, yes, yes, this is how we're solving it. And so we got that early kind of validation. And so we built our first prototype and had our first project using it within about 2-3 months. And then we open sourced the software, and then from there it was this just gradual process of iteration. Talking to more projects, getting them to use it, seeing where they're getting stuck, and it really takes a lot of work to build tools and infrastructure for developers, because developers are really tough customers. They're super opinionated. They want a bunch of stuff. If anything isn't exactly the way they want, you're going to hear about it. And so I think it was really great for us to kind of launch early and just put in the time, just iterating and adding more and more features. And so, I think going from like the third project building on the graph to the fourth, was a lot of work. And then, there's still more features that the fifth project, needed that we couldn't support. And so in the early days, adding support for new projects took a lot of time. And then eventually, probably around like, 10 or so, we started getting to this point of kind of feature completeness where really anyone could build on the graph, basically self-serve without, needing our engineers to kind of help them along. And I think that's when we really, saw our growth, start exploding.
And how does the industry around you changed from kind of like those excitement of 2017 joining in early 2018 or around that time and like up to now? What have you seen so far?
Well, the industry has changed a lot. But for us, things have basically stayed the same. I mean, in some ways, there's even, there's much better, more interesting development happening now than there even was, 2 years ago. So, I think from a builder's perspective, nothing's changed. I think, in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of kind of like alignment behind what we were building. You know, people really bought into this idea of decentralization, and they're like, okay, we're going to decentralize everything. And there was so much momentum and excitement, and people are like, yes, this is happening now. And the infrastructure just wasn't ready. And there were a lot of really talented developers that were trying to build things, but weren't quite able to build the stuff that they wanted to build. And so, I think kind of like, one by one, people realize, oh, this is a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. And so I think a lot of that initial kind of excitement has kind of died down. And so we've, gone through this kind of difficult period now of actually like evaluating, okay, what of this stuff is real? What's missing? What's preventing us from actually being able to build decentralized systems of coordinations? And it's just been this kind of like painstaking, like brick by brick kind of work to like build out that foundation and infrastructure.
And what do you see as a main challenge like right now at this point in time?
Oh, I think there's a lot of challenges. There still aren't very many applications that I think you can point to where you could say this is a great experience that, is fully decentralized, that, I could onboard my friends onto. It's obviously really easy to build centralized apps, on the traditional Web 2 stack. And, we've been doing that for, a decade plus. It took a lot of iteration, but like that infrastructure has matured. And so that's easy, but building fully decentralized applications is tough. And so what most, teams have had to do is kind of decide what are the places where we're going to sacrifice on decentralization in order to ship something that's usable. And so I think that's kind of this, it's this weird place to be, because on the one hand it makes total sense. As a company, you can't survive for years without a product. And so you need to ship something. But if the thing that you're shipping is just a centralized app, we're not actually fulfilling this vision or even contributing to this vision. And I think, there's going to be a lot that becomes possible as more and more decentralized infrastructure and applications mature. But, if what you're building is a centralized app, then you're not actually contributing to that. And so I think that's really, the challenge. And there's a lot of really difficult problems to doing things in a decentralized way. So, we kind of fundamentally have to solve, big problems around things like identity, reputation, establishing patterns for, and kind of the game theory around how to like handle disputes and, security and just like all of these little things that are, we're establishing, brand new patterns. And so I think that that's kind of, this process that we're on. And I think once we've kind of, built and established enough of these patterns really well, then, entrepreneurs will be able to pretty easily mix and match these things, in order to, solve real problems that exist in the marketplace.
Maybe we can also discuss a little bit your blog post that you published like end of 2019, the path to Web3. Like, what was the inspiration for it?
Yeah, so 2018 was just like interesting year where we were obviously like in the midst of this kind of bear market, and I kind of felt that a lot of developers were losing steam, and I wanted to kind of like put this kind of stake in the ground to kind of reaffirm the ideals of decentralization and of Web3 and what we're building. I just kind of got sick of hearing people be like, "Oh, decentralization doesn't matter," right? And oh, things don't need to be decentralized, and why are we even doing this? And it's tough because yeah, it's a lot of work. We're building on for like years now with this, on this like vision, right? On this like dream of how the world can be different, and it's hard to sustain that over a period of years. And so the point of the post was to try to reaffirm the vision, and maybe provide guideposts for how we can actually get there.
And you mentioned there are a couple of misconceptions that people have. Like, for example, people care enough about privacy, self-sovereignty to suffer through the bad UX. And you're saying that this is completely wrong. Users seem to value convenience, ease of use, functionality above idealism. Have you seen like good applications that like represent this in space so far? Like really kind of good product teams like building like really good experiences.
Yeah, I think one interesting example is Magic Link. They just launched. It's like a hosted key management solution that was kind of previously Fortmatic. and they make it really easy for developers to do this kind of like, what they call these magic links, which is using your email to authenticate the same way that Slack does without needing to use any passwords. And that's, I thought they did a really slick job with the UX there, even though it is a hosted wallet solution. And I think in an ideal world, you'd be able to, have control of your own keys. A lot of the friction right now is around kind of this onboarding process and key management, which there's some good teams kind of working on that. Um, Audius is actually, I think, a great example of a project that's got a really great user experience. And I think that they also really value decentralization. So Audius is this music streaming application, kind of like a SoundCloud, but all of the data is hosted on IPFS. So it's decentralized, and I think they're coming up with interesting ways for artists and content creators to kind of monetize on top of the platform. And I think they've done a really good job with UX. But yeah, I think it's this thing again with this kind of tension that we have to solve between decentralization and centralization, because I think that ultimately we need to build fully decentralized applications. But there's all of these trends happening in the world of like loss of trust in like the media, and even in like governments and in banks and university systems, and people like wondering like should I be taking on significant debt in order to just go to college to get some degree from some university. And there's a lot of this kind of like tension with the existing system, where I think that like people would like to have more control. There is this, they would like to, you know, have a better sense of like what is true. you know, um, where can I find truth, or um, and so there are like fundamental, I think, like pains in society at large, but these are all kind of abstract concepts. And I think that like individuals, make decisions on a day-to-day basis a lot of times just on the basis of convenience. Just like I have an immediate need, and I'm going to just grab the thing next to me, whatever's around that's going to like solve this immediate need easiest. And ultimately I think that's how people kind of operate. And so one kind of framing that I like is to help people fall into the pit of success, right? Where like the easy thing is the right thing or the best thing for them, right? Because people want easy. And so I think we have to build tools, products, experiences that help people fall into the pit of success, where the easiest thing, the thing that they want to use, is also the thing that for example, helps them maintain privacy, gives them sovereignty over their own data, helps kind of incrementally solve some of these like societal issues. But ultimately, it's, by building products that solve real needs that people have in an easy, low friction way.
And you also mentioned in the same blog post also that decentralization, a lot of people think is too expensive, can't win against centralized services. You're saying it's also not true.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're starting, we're seeing some of that, first of all, with some of these next generation blockchains, where, you're getting, transaction fees to like, well under a cent, on a blockchain like Solana. I'm not sure what you guys are projecting for near, but, I bet you can get transaction fees to under a cent. So like, how often do you, publish a Facebook post, or, publish a blog post, or, perform these types of actions? It's not that much. And so if you perform 100 actions a day, and it costs you, 10 cents to a dollar a day for like everything that you're doing in your digital life, that's actually, probably less than you're spending on your like Netflix subscription, right? So I don't think it's true that it's too expensive to use this stuff. Now, Sure, early blockchains like Bitcoin, ETH1, they are expensive. But I think they're kind of early versions of these blockchains, and so even I think blockchains themselves, I think can be implemented at a price that makes sense to use. And then there's other types of decentralized networks that actually don't have the same property of blockchains, where you don't need like thousands of nodes to be validating an action. So a good example would be like LivePeer, right? That's doing video transcoding. So on a network like that, you could actually provide video transcoding cheaper on a decentralized network where you're able to tap into like unused GPUs and have where people have extra capacity and they can add that into the network automatically without overhead, without having to maintain like a high margin centralized P&L. So I think there's going to be a lot of services where actually the decentralized versions are cheaper. So yeah, I think that's a big misconception that people say, oh, decentralization can't work because it's too expensive.
Hmm. What do you think also about another misconception around business models? Because a lot of people critique, right? Like some companies, like I was working with one inch recently, and they have a really good traction, and a lot of people say like, well, that's great, but how do you capture value from like investor perspective? How do you address that?
Yeah, I think this is very similar to where we were at with the internet in say 2003, 2004, where, we had like the dot-com bust and then suddenly everyone was like, "Oh, you can't make money on the internet." Right? They're like, "It's great, you've got eyeballs, but, it's never going to translate to revenue." And a lot of investors thought that way. But, there were some really smart, shrewd investors who thought from first principles, and they were looked at companies like Facebook that were growing really fast, and were like, you know what, they're gonna find a way to monetize, and I think those were good investments. So if this stuff works, it is going to be really, really massive, right? It's what is the value of human coordination and information systems? We're in the information age, right? Everything is information, and so the value is massive. Now we're very early in this. The market is still small because we're still building out the infrastructure to be able to build really great applications. And so in a small market, the market size is small, but those foundational pieces, the infrastructure, those foundational applications that start growing the early communities, and the projects that are well positioned, I think will be in a good position to capture value. Now, the value capture mechanisms and the business models, they're going to be new. Internet companies like Facebook didn't monetize by charging for shrink wrapped CD-ROMs, right? Every new technological platform has new business models, and I think the protocols are for Web3, kind of have new business models with things like work tokens, which I think we're going to see proved out as being like a strong kind of fundamentals based business model for infrastructure. And I think there's a lot of things that applications can do to monetize. The fact that we have a platform that has money, right? It like just internet programmable money built in. It's just unfathomable to me to believe that we can't come up with ways of paying people that deserve to be paid. And I think that really these are open systems, right? And so with open systems, you can't force people into a bad deal, right? If you're trying to cheat me or like, twist my arm into like paying you something that you don't deserve, I'm going to exit, right? I'm going to choose to go somewhere else. But I think people in general have a pretty, good compass for what's fair. And if there's a system that's fair, you're providing me a service and you need to get paid, right? There's not a person on the planet that doesn't understand that. And so, it's all about just kind of, designing these systems and protocols and applications such that they have like, fair value exchange built into them. And when we design that in a way that's easy to use and kind of, removes friction, I think the business models are going to sort themselves out.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'm on the same page. Also, like when you think about continuation of this space, like in looking last like decade, it started with like store of value, like Bitcoin started there, right? Then it moved into a programmability aspect with Ethereum, first version of Ethereum, right? That supports kind of like high value, low volume transfers in a way. Do you think we're moving into a direction where we're going to be also be able to support low value, high volume transfers? So it's moving from like open finance to like open web type of scenario, especially with companies like Twitter, Reddit looking into the space.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of these layer two kind of solutions are going to be able to help bring that about. And I think some of these next generation blockchains will also be able to help with that. I think having like more block space, across more chains, whether they're app specific chains or sharded chains or lots of different configurations. I think just like there isn't a single database to rule them all, it depends on your application. I think it'll make sense to do different types of workloads on different types of chains, either on the base layers or on layer twos. So yeah, it seems to me that we're fairly close to getting to that point where the transactions are kind of cheap enough that they can be used for not just for high value transactions. And even then, I think it's a spectrum of value interaction. So, for me to be able to send $1 million across the globe, instantly within a few seconds, like that's pretty magical, and that's a high value transaction. And yeah, even if it cost me a dollar, $2, it's way cheaper than my alternative. But there's a lot of interactions that are somewhere between 0.00001 cents in value and $2, right? So if I'm like publishing a blog post and I want to stamp to the world, hey, I Yaniv published this blog post in 2020, right? And it's on the record. Is that worth 10 cents? Like for sure. I think there's a lot of interactions that already kind of past that threshold of being worth the price of running on even like a first generation blockchain.
Yep. Maybe we can also touch briefly on how you think about the product market fit. I think in the same blog you had kind of like sequence starting with product market fit with initial set of decentralized applications, then getting crypto community to switch over, and then growing based on the quality of the products into like larger communities outside of Web3. Do you think that's a correct sequence for a lot of applications, or it would really depend case by case?
Yeah, well, I think it does depend case by case. Like for example, Audius would be a good like exception to that rule, or they're going kind of this other route of building a really great consumer experience that can get a lot of users. Anyone who listens to music, could want to use Audius, and artists who don't want to have their music censored. So I don't think it's the only way, but it is, this route of kind of starting with people that are kind of crypto native is particularly interesting to me because I think we need to really kind of like build up, what it means to be a crypto native. And if we can't do that for ourselves, then I think it's a fool's errand to try to convince other people to do it. Right. So I think, change starts at home, right? And like we're already bought into the vision. Like we want to make decentralization happen. Great. What's one thing that I've done today to build up my reputation on, with my self-sovereign identity on a decentralized network? I haven't done anything today personally. I don't know about you. And so, that strikes me as a problem because that's the world we're trying to build. And we don't have the applications yet where we're actually doing it. So like let's start there. Like let's get to a point where like Yaniv, right, this co-founder of a decentralized network who really cares about decentralization is starting to, build out, his digital identity, on a blockchain. And so that's kind of the route that I'm kind of, personally interested in and focus on. And I think that we can get there pretty soon. I think we're close. I think this year we can have a handful of apps that are great experiences, load fast, beautiful, easy to use, that we would ourselves choose to use. And then I think the other thing is that a lot of these applications, they kind of like require network effects. But the crypto community is a really tight knit community, right? It's its own network, right? It's already kind of gotten to the point where like I kind of don't care what's happening in the rest of tech and the rest of whatever, because it's just not interesting to me anymore, right? Like I've gone down the rabbit hole. Crypto's my community. Like I really want to know what everybody in crypto is thinking. I really want to know what people are up to in crypto and what they're working on. And so, I think that there's enough of a network there where we can actually get to those initial network effects within that community. And then once we do, when we go out to the outside world and we're like, hey, join our movement, we're not hypocrites, right? Like there actually is a movement to join because the stuff is real and we're using it.
Yep. Well, I think we can close on this strong note.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sasha. Really enjoyed the conversation.
So thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go-to-market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.